How's this? All right. Well, I'm really honored to have been invited to speak this morning, to be part of your series on how to live a good life, and especially to share this morning with Hannah Rose. Today is April Fool's Day. It was a blue moon. First baby goats were born. Today is spring. Today is Passover. Today is Easter. Today we can be especially mindful of people who are trapped in the insanity of war in Syria, in Yemen, in Gaza. And today I want to talk about hope and how to love this world. When I saw that today was April Fool's Day, I first thought, this day is loaded enough and I'm going to just completely ignore that. It has nothing to do with hope or love, but it kept asserting itself. And so I decided to listen, because I thought maybe it would trip me up if I didn't. And I saw that the archetype of the sacred fool has everything to do with loving the world. The sacred fool appears across cultures as the truth teller, the speaker of unedited truth, revealer of blind spots and shadow, all we don't want to acknowledge or see. The truth teller that knocks us off balance so that we can see more, gain a better perspective, grow, and become more whole. So in these times, truth-telling in the way of the sacred fool that aligns the innocence of the child and the wisdom of the elder is how we love the world. For the pre-Christian traditions, this is the time when we celebrate the return of the sun, the promise of spring, the birds, that although all appears to be dead on the surface, life comes back after the hard press of winter, and deep underground inside the seed, a mystery is at work, preparing to emerge, and it will be soft in color, delicate, sweet in smell, and it will astonish us that something so fragile and beautiful and full of life can be forged under such harsh circumstances. In the Jewish tradition, today is Passover, the beginning, when after so much injustice and resistance, the iron fist of the Pharaoh is weakened and the slaves are freed. And in the Christian tradition, today is Easter, a celebration of resistance, resilience, and new life, the story of a community at a time of empire and insanity that is afraid and full of despair and thinks all has been lost. It's a community in ashes that finds a spark, discovers what they're capable of, and amasses the courage to see the future again. The Easter story follows insanity and trauma of public torture, death by crucifixion of a beloved teacher, whose life, whether you take it as historic fact or as story, is all about what it means to love this world, to stand with the vulnerable, the outcast, the hungry, the sick, the poor, the refugee, the migrant, the students, and the survivors of gun violence. And to be a truth teller, unwavering until the end, who even when the sword comes out in his own defense says, no, this won't save us, and points to a different kind of power. A teacher who enters fully into betrayal, forsakenness, and despair, and says to the community, stay awake, don't go back to sleep. Who looks human evil in the eye and chooses to love, knocking us off balance, and pointing to a vision of a better future, more whole, on the other side of insanity. And this Easter story is archetypical and universal and timeless. We see it in Buddhism, in the stories of the bodhisattvas, those who take that vow of suffering to return to earth again and again. Joanna Macy, who teaches us about despair and love and the great turning of our times, speaks of one, a bodhisattva named Jiso, who is her inspiration. She says he's the one who voluntarily descends into the deepest levels of hell because he can hear crying there. He goes into suffering, not to rescue or to save. This is no arrogant macho journey, but rather, if my brothers and sisters are there, I will go be with them. I will own this part of human experience. And if there's any waking up, we all wake up together. So at this time of empire and insanity, Mary Oliver, the poet, says there is only one question: how to love the world. And Krista Tippett, from her interviews on how to be wise, says love is the only aspiration big enough for the immensity of our challenge in the 21st century. People who turn the world on its axis across history call humanity to love. And it is time to dare this more bravely, to dare learning together how love can be practical, creative, and sustained as a social good. So I sat with Mary Oliver's question, and I found myself surrounded with Easter stories and bodhisattvas and sacred fools, everyday people, and how they love the world, and I wanted to share a few of them today. In December, friends and human rights defenders from Honduras put out a call for emergency international presence following an electoral coup and a human rights crisis that was blowing up. So I worked with 3 other organizations throughout the holiday, and we put together an emergency religious leaders delegation to Honduras in January. We had very short notice. It needed to be high profile. It was not a good time to organize. So we said, we can get 7. And people said, great. And then they said, it's getting much worse. We need more. So we said, okay, we'll work on it. And we got 14. And they said, that's great. And they said, but it's getting worse. We need more. And we got 20. And we were really proud. And then they said, it's got to be big. This is going off the rails. We got 40. And they pressed again and said, they're going to kill us. And we got 52, plus media. People from 8 denominations, from 40 spiritual communities, from 13 states across the country, heard the cries of the people and went to be with them. And then they went to the U.S. Embassy to tell the truth. I want to share just 3 testimonies from 3 of these leaders who went to Honduras and spoke at the embassy in January. First is Darren from the Marino Office of Global Concerns. He said to the embassy, the fingerprints of the U.S. are all over these murders. Tear gas, munition, and weapons are from the U.S. We train elite security forces, police, and military. They stand together, operate together, terrorize and kill together, and the State Department certifies them on human rights. Scott, from the Columban Center for Advocacy, said 1 month before Archbishop Romero was murdered in 1980, he wrote to President Jimmy Carter and pleaded with him to suspend aid to El Salvador, that this money would only be used to repress the people. This is what we see in Honduras today. Heavily armed elite battalions trained by the U.S., masks on their faces, no names on their uniforms, shooting unarmed young people, women, and men. Marianne, a spiritual director and human rights accompanier. She said, we are close to the people. We accompany them. We told the State Department in the 70s and the 80s what was happening in Central America. The U.S. was on the wrong side of history then. The UN Truth Commissions said so. And we told you when there was still time. But our government did not listen to us. Are you listening now? We know what is unfolding. We have seen this before. I just returned from Washington. I had to work through a lot of despair to make that trip. But in the spirit of the Bodhisattva Jiso, I decided I could go. And we organized a congressional briefing so that members of that delegation could report what they had seen in the streets of Honduras. And Berta Oliva, our friend from Honduras from the families of the disappeared, whose daughter has been here, she came to talk about the crisis. She arrived almost at midnight at the DCA airport, and I was waiting for her as she came off the gate, and I could see the exhaustion and the weight of these years on her. And she saw me, and she put her bag down, and she looked up and she said, "I didn't know if I would ever see you again." I said, "I know. I didn't know either." And at that briefing, 3 members of the family of Berta Cáceres were there. Emotions were strong and the room was packed. Berta Oliva was the last to speak. And she said, "Today, we must all be Berta Cáceres. We must all stand up and speak the truth." And I was at her side translating, and my voice shook and tears erupted because we all know that she could very well be the next Berta Cáceres. And then her voice shook when she heard mine, and I saw her big tears plopping onto the table. So I looked over at Berta Cáceres' family because I needed to recover, because we needed to get this right. And I see that their faces are full of tears. And we were all knocked off balance. But in this intervulnerability, we found our voices, and we found what we were capable of. And we held that briefing room in rapt attention, and something better and very powerful happened there. And afterwards, we went downstairs into the Rayburn House office building cafeteria, and we were going to have lunch. And I'm in the checkout line, and I see Representative Marcy Kaptur from Ohio standing there with her tray. This is a woman who stands up for the poor and the vulnerable. And I said, "Marcy," I said, "here's the Sisters of Berta Cáceres, and here's Berta Oliva from Honduras." And she sat her tray down, and she said, "What more could we have done? How could we have protected her? What more can we do to speak out? Can I sit with you?" So we all gathered around a table, and Representative Marcy Kaptur pressed us, and she questioned us, and she said, "We have to have a strategy." And after about 45 minutes of this, one of our group said, "Representative Kaptur, you sound like a community organizer." And she said, "I am a community organizer, and we all better be organizing our communities because we need to get to a new place. We need a new paradigm. We need our truth tellers to stay alive, no more martyrs." And then she said to me, "I want you to tell Berta this." And she looked right at her and she said, "You might need asylum someday. You can stay in my apartment." She spent over an hour and a half with us. Afterwards, Medea Benjamin of Code Pink, your friend, came up. I had seen her at the briefing, and apparently she had been in the cafeteria and witnessed this whole encounter. She is one of the most practical and creative and daring truth tellers in our country today. And she said, "That was incredible." She said, "She stayed with you for over an hour and a half. That doesn't happen here." She said, "She's listening. She really cares." This is how to love the world. In January, I was in Nicaragua, and we visited a community-run language school called La Mariposa, the butterfly. It's set at the top of a mountain on a cloud forest and a watershed just south of the steaming sprawl of Managua. And this place is being deforested because of plantations of pineapple and dragon fruit for export to the US, driven by the free trade policies imposed by our country and the international banks. But the people of Mariposa are working to protect the land and the clouds and the water and the trees that are home to spider monkeys and Congo monkeys and morpho butterflies and margays and toucans. And Mariposa is also home to a beehive of community projects, taking water to communities that don't have any, therapy for differently abled children, bakeries, libraries, reforestation, tutoring projects, composting. It is also home to 100 and some dogs and 20 plus horses that have been rescued off the street in extreme cases of neglect and abuse. Some said they were foolish to take those on. And everyone says it has dramatically increased the well-being of animals overall. My friend Paulette says she can hardly find a dog to rescue now. And sitting amidst this myriad of needs, I said, what can we do to support this little revolution that you have going here? And she leaned back and she got very quiet and she thought for a few moments. And then she said, we need an environmental delegation. It needs to be experiential and it needs to look at the international policies driving the destruction of ecosystems like this one. I was knocked off balance. I took one quick look around and I could generate a list of about 1 million things they needed to be asking for right then. But they were asking for people to come to this beautiful place called La Concepcion, the place of conception, because this is where the water is born, where life begins. To hear its cry, to be with, to understand the international linkage that threatens land, forest, and waters everywhere, so that we can wake up together. And this is how we love the world. In Fenville, Michigan, in February, at the end of a dark winter day and a huge snowstorm, there's a knock at the door, and there's 2 neighbors, hard, diligent workers doing jobs that no one else does, indispensable to the agriculture sector in this state. One is from Honduras, indigenous. He came with a wave of forced migration following the 2009 military coup that was backed by our government. And then the country became one of the most violent in the world. And families were sending children north to keep them alive. And the United Nations told the US that they were refugees and that they must be protected. But our government would not listen to the United Nations because our government was listening to General Kelly, who said, detain and deport them. But against all odds, Santiago and his cousin found work and learned to live in the shadows. And they explained that Santiago's cousin had been struck by a car. And that morning they had gotten a call from the hospital that he had died. So Santiago had called his aunt in the mountains of Honduras to tell her the news, and she was devastated. And she said, send him back so I can bury him here and see him one last time. So they were out trying to find his body, and no one would talk to them in a system in which they have no rights. So we waited for Tom to get home, and in the meantime I made some calls, and I could confirm that it was going to cost a lot of money to send his body back, and it needed to happen really quickly. And so I'm trying to gently break this news that this was really a mission impossible and that this really might not be able to happen. No way to come up with the money fast enough. And they headed out into the dark night and the heavy snow. Hours later, they had found him. Within a few days, this community of people that live in the shadows, that work hard at low-paying jobs, for whom every trip to the corner store is to risk the disaster of being captured, deported, separated from children who are full US citizens, had raised the money to send his cousin who they don't even know, back to his mom. To make sure that the last word on this one life of struggle and suffering be one of compassion and human solidarity. And I've seen this community rally for each other like this again and again. Fast, strong, generous, this gift economy, this social good, rooted in the deep soil of human intervulnerability and solidarity. This system that pays forward, understanding that when it is your turn, all this love will come back to you. I was the recipient of this social good when I broke my arm last fall. And friends came despite the risk that every trip entailed. And they brought food and they swept my house and they brushed my hair until I could do it myself. This is how you love the world. In March, I was at the Sundance Center in Fenville. I got out into the horse pasture early one morning with my halter and a rope and work on my way. And I found the horses down on the ground, their enormous bodies stretched out long against the earth, now thawed after months of winter. And they invited me to drop the rope, to drop my agenda, my plan, my need to get something done, to simply sit down on the earth, to be with them in their circle of trust, to sit amidst their massive sides rising and falling with each breath, to notice their tangled array of feet, so different from mine, to reach over and hold one as if it were a hand. They invited me not to miss this moment, to soak in that delicate morning winter sun, to connect with this great peace, this ground of being, where love pours into and out of us and love just flows through, to spend more time here. This is how we love the world. A few days later, in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, my friend David, who some of you have met when he came here, sent me a photo of himself and 5 women. They've chained themselves to a pipeline that is carrying fracked oil, and they've shut down operations for several hours now. The police can't cut them loose because they're in this PCB tubing. But then they get arrested, and he can think of nothing more practical or more creative to do with his retirement than this social good. And he's inspired by people all over the country who are doing the same, and inspired by the rulings of judges, like one that came down in Massachusetts this week, finding that 13 protesters who had laid their bodies in trenches to block a pipeline construction were not responsible, and that their action was justified because of the urgent need to stop climate change. This is how to love the world. And on March 24th, all across this country, people marched for our lives. After a massacre on Valentine's Day at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Florida, those students and those survivors stood up. And they turned that mass shooting on its head and said, enough. This will be the last. Never again. Nunca, jamás. And they took up the call from the people of Latin America who for decades have been saying enough to our country's killing. And these students broke the iron ceiling on gun control in this country and have generated the first economic sanctions on the gun industry. They are informed, articulate, politically savvy, and they are going to vote. And they are leveraging their privilege to raise the voices of their brothers and sisters in our inner cities who are battered by gun violence every day of their lives and for whom it is never over. Like the children of Alton Sterling and the children of Stephen Clark, a 22-year-old unarmed African-American man shot at least 8 times in the back in his own backyard. And they speak his name because it is not a local matter. It is a systemic human rights emergency in this country. And these truth tellers who are 9 and 11 and 17 years old have spiritual muscle and vision. And they are taking us somewhere on the other side of despair. They are our spark in ashes. This is how to love the world. And lastly, how to love this world. Be a community to which someone can run on a spring morning with shock and a broken heart because a great woman, a beloved friend and teacher, a recipient of the Green Nobel Prize, has been shot dead in Honduras because she had a vision of rivers running free and told the truth about empire and militarism and corporate greed. And be a woman like Hannah Rose, who hears her story and stands up and channels a song that comes straight out of the soul of the whole thing. A song that carried the weight like a strong boat. A song that brought Doris Rucks to her feet and elicited a sound from her depths. A sound like Hannah's song and like Berta's voice we will never hear again, but stays with us forever and ever. And be a community that 2 years later brings us all back together on an Easter morning to remember all those who love this world, who give us their vision, to celebrate life, to sing, to carry the weight, to discover what we're capable of, to amass the collective courage, to dare more bravely to love this world. And I'm going to close where we began with that question of Mary Oliver. And it comes from one of her poems called Spring. And it's about a bear, universal symbol of transformation and the creative, protective, powerful love that our world needs now. Spring. Somewhere, a black bear has just risen from sleep and is staring down the mountain all night in the brisk and shallow restlessness of an early spring. I think of her 4 black fists flicking the gravel, her tongue like a red fire, touching the grass, the cold water. There is only one question: how to love this world. I think of her rising like a blackened leafy ledge, sharpening her claws against the silence of trees. Whatever else my life is, with its poems and its music and its glass cities, it is also this dazzling darkness coming down the mountain. All day I think of her white teeth, her wordlessness, her perfect, her powerful love. Happy Easter.